This is Wilmington's first town hall, and it was built in 1798. It took them about 6 years to actually build it because it just took longer back then. But this was the civic center of this community. This was literally the heart of Wilmington for about 100 years. Town halls of that era were not just government buildings. They were where people gathered for any reason. When George Washington died, and they rang the bell, and people from all over town came down to town hall and gathered sort of for an impromptu sort of group mourning when that happened. But the courts were held here. There are still jail cells underneath. They were built as holding cells. They weren't a prison. The prison was in Newcastle. So if you were given a jail sentence, you would serve that in Newcastle. There were only 2 cells, and they're not big spaces, so there's no heating or light down there. So it really looks like a medieval dungeon, to be honest. So if you were housed down there, you had no natural lighting and only candlelight, and there's no plumbing, and there's no heating or cooling. So you kept warm as best you could, or cool as best you could, and you went in a chamber pot in the corner. Elections were held here, town meetings were held here, but fun things were held here too. They had national speakers who would come through, and people who were on the lecture circuit back in the 1800s and give talks. You had traveling inventors back in those days, and people would go from city to city showing off their inventions, and that happened here too. There are 3 rooms upstairs. There's one large room that goes across the entire back of the building called the long room. And it's called the long room because it's a long, skinny room. And it is in town halls of the era what that room was always called. Town halls tended to have a long room upstairs, and it's where the city council would have met. So it would have been a private space. It was unlike the main hall room here. It would have been a space that you were invited to if you were invited to go to a city council meeting for whatever reason. There are 2 smaller rooms on the wing side of the staircase, and they were rented out for community organizations that could pay a rental fee. So about the time of the Civil War, this building was starting to be a little too small for city business. I mean, cities grew. I mean, by the time of the Civil War, we had permanent city employees instead of folks who were mostly volunteer, burgesses and that kind of thing. So we needed permanent offices for those people. So the meeting rooms upstairs turned into offices. This space became more of a permanent courtroom by about that time. The courts were meeting more often. There was more crime. You needed more court time. After the Civil War, they really stopped having public events here. And not too long after the Civil War, they actually took this large open space and divided it up into offices. But it still served the city. They kind of tried to Victorianize the building after the Civil War because this building was built in 1798. The Quaker fathers who commissioned it had asked for a plain, handsome building. And it's a very pretty space, but it's plain, it's of its time. It's a colonial structure and a Quaker colonial structure. It's not a fancy building. The Victorians liked very fancy, gingerbready, colorful things, and this building looked very old-fashioned. So they took the small cupola, which we have a reproduction of now that's outside of the building, they took that down and added this great big giant cupola that if this was a ship, it would have sunk the ship. They put in Venetian blinds and other sort of Victorian things, but it was really an office building. They even expanded the building. In the 1870s, they built a wing on the back of the building. By the time of World War I, the building was in use for over 100 years. It was battered and beaten up and way too small, and the spaces were just not any longer right for a government building. They were going to tear it down because this was prime market real estate by the 19-teens. And the Historical Society of Delaware, which had been around since the Civil War, talked the city into selling it to them instead of tearing the building down. When Wilmington had built Old Town Hall, it had cost $1,500, and it put Wilmington into permanent debt. The city never got out of debt after that, paying for Old Town Hall. When the Historical Society bought the building, I think we paid something like $90,000 for it, which is a lot of money back in the 19 teens. And the Historical Society went into debt for a number of years after buying the building as well, but they eventually were able to pay their debt off due to the generosity of the community. It really does take us back to a time where this was the heart of Wilmington. This was not just a government building, it was a civic building, and this is where people gathered to celebrate, to mourn. This is where the Civil War draft was held. I mean, important things happened here, little things happened here. It was where anything could happen and where everybody was welcome. It was a building that everybody owned together. And that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, we have government buildings all over town, but they have a very specific purpose, and you are only welcome there if you have business there. This was a space that belonged to everybody, and everybody gathered here. This is where people gathered when something big happened. They celebrated it, or they mourned it, or they argued about it together.